Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson. I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, we continue our series, Hitchcock Before Hollywood, a look at his rich period of the 1930s in his native United Kingdom. Today's film from 1936 is Sabotage, and quite confusingly, it's based upon the novel The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad, although Hitchcock had made a film called The Secret Agent beforehand. Therefore, he could not use the title. But in any case, this is a terrific film about terrorism in London, and it gives a super portrait of this city itself and has a number of classic Hitchcock sequences frequently taught in film schools. We'll be talking about that and much more today with scholar Professor Robert Higney from the City College of New York, an expert on Conrad and on 20th century British narrative. Now, take this journey into the terrorist threat in London in 1936. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity to see one of Alfred Hitchcock's key films of the 1930s and an adaptation of a rather important novel by Joseph Conrad. We have a lot to talk about in the next 30 minutes, Conrad and Hitchcock, but a lot of aspects of the film as well. And it's a pleasure to welcome to City Cinematheque one of my colleagues from the City College of New York, Professor Robert Higney. Robert and I have worked on a number of committees together. We have many shared interests, so it's a real pleasure to have him here. He is, among other things, a Conrad scholar. His recent book, Institutional Character, covers Conrad as well as a number of other 20th century British novelists. He also works on the whole question of British identity as represented in British storytelling in the 20th century. Pleasure to have you here, Robert.
It's great to be here, Jerry. Thank you.
Super. Well, let's just start with Conrad, and what we would summarize is Conrad's novel is about and what he's up to, and then how it gets repurposed, because certainly it's repurposed by Hitchcock. So we'll start with Conrad and move towards Hitchcock.
Sure. So Conrad is a really interesting figure in the history of the British novel.
Right.
Right. He's born actually in what's now Ukraine, to a Polish family. Right. English is actually his third language. Right. And he comes to literature late in life after being a sailor, first mate on several ships. This places him at an odd angle to sort of Britishness and British culture. He has a kind of critical eye on things. His novels, I think, tend to have, and this is perhaps why he's lent himself to adaptation so readily, right? Characters who are either very simple, or characters who are almost unreadably complicated, or sort of blanks.
Yeah.
And his language can be quite difficult in many ways, and yet I think those characters, right, those kinds of really compelling sort of characters are at the center of his stories all the time. And that's lent those stories to adaptation over the decades. Perhaps most famously, Apocalypse Now, which is adapted from Heart of Darkness. The Secret Agent is the novel itself is a bleak story, and folks who've just seen the film know some of the outlines of it. Right?
Okay.
The character of Mr. Verloc, I think, is quite true to Conrad's vision in a lot of ways. The ending of the novel is quite different. Mrs. Verloc, in fact, kills herself at the end of the novel after events similar to what we've seen transpire. It's a very ambiguous story. There's a significant subplot that Hitchcock removes involving the anarchist group that Verloc is part of. Right? They don't really feature in the film in quite the same way.
Right.
Verloc in the novel is an agent provocateur, right? He is tasked with setting a bomb at the Greenwich Observatory, right? This sort of the place that sets global time, right?
Well, it says global time, yeah.
Attacking time itself in a way. And there's a whole subplot with a complicated set of characters. Some of those figures are pulled into the main narrative of the film by Hitchcock, the bomb maker, right? Who, as we see at the end of the film, is in fact concealing a bomb on his person at all times, right? This is an important figure in the novel, The Secret Agent. I think one kind of key, one shorthand for the difference between the novel and the film is that in the novel, the bomb on the professor never goes off, right? There's a sort of sustained ambiguity about that character and about conclusion in the novel, right? Sort of, it's a tragic but ambiguous ending. In the film that we've just seen, things are wrapped up quite a bit more neatly, actually, because that bomb goes off.
Right, absolutely.
Although not as neatly, I think, as some reviewers have thought.
Well, and I'm going to make a general remark on Hitchcock, and Hitchcock is one of those people who, even in his simpler films, and people would consider things like Vertigo and Psycho to be the really complicated films in terms of how they're manipulating many, many things. But even in the simple films, which and everything gets wrapped up in this, there's always something else. There's always something, there, and there's always that possibility of a kind of double reading. If you want to take it, if you want to believe it's completely wrapped up, go right ahead. But if you want to inspect it a little bit more carefully, you will find that. Not true say in all of his, because sometimes he will go for an incredibly unambiguous, strong closure. We will be screening the Lady Vanishes in this, and I think that's a film that has it. I think the 39 Steps has, but I think you're absolutely on the mark here that there's a false cleanness to the ending in a certain kind of way. So, the Conrad is also an explicitly political novel.
It is, yes. Although not as in comparison to the film, yes.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Conrad had a lifelong antipathy toward Russia and the idea of Russia, in many ways, because of the history of his family, the Polish nation, Russian Empire. Certainly, the novel is one in which the terrorists are quite clearly aligned with left-wing politics. The implication is pretty strong that there are Russian connections or Eastern European connections of some sort, and the bombing that's carried out is part of a larger political plot.
Right.
Now in the film, that's I think to the contemporary viewer, who exactly those terrorists are is a bit unclear. Now it's 1936 in England, and I think that we're meant to understand that the plot that's shaping up is a German plot, right? That the implied villain here is Nazi Germany.
Right.
And the terrorists in the film are all kind of interestingly marked as other in some way, although not in consistent ways, right? They're certainly not British, right? In sort of normative ways. Mr. Verloc, of course, has a somewhat thick accent.
Right.
A couple of the other figures who we see in the meeting in his living room at one point, also speak with an Eastern European or a German accent. Even the fellow who doesn't, who pulls Detective Spencer through the window at one point, is sort of marked as gangsterish. Right?
Well, yeah. They're in that sense they're sort of depoliticized. They seem to be these intermediaries, that they are available to provide services in a certain kind of way from a kind of criminal element that you would use the word criminal rather than anarchist who commits crimes kinds of things.
Yeah, and as the chief inspector says to Spencer at one point, well, we're never going to see who's behind it, right? Our job is to get the men that they employ.
Right.
Right. So there is a noting that there's a bigger political context, but then sort of setting it off stage, right? Setting it to the side.
No, very much so, and then turning this into much more a drama of family life in a certain kind of way.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the really interesting and maybe not immediately obvious things about the film is that there are multiple families in which things are out of order in some way.
Okay.
Right.
Talk about that.
The Verloc family.
Yeah.
Right. There's Mr. Verloc, who notably in the film, in the novel, his name is Adolf.
Oops. Bad thing in 1936, right?
Well, or would be too much in a way.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Would mark him as associated with Nazi Germany. So his name has been changed to Karl.
Right.
And we never learn Mrs. Verloc's first name, although in the novel she's Winnie.
Right.
But their family is a bit of an odd little unit, right? At one point, Spencer says to her when they're having lunch at Simpson's, "Well, so you're one happy little family, aren't you?" And she says, "Well, one happy little family." Right? They're precisely not that in any traditional sense, right? Stevie is sort of Mr. Verloc's son, but is actually his wife's brother. Mrs. Verloc appears to be the person who operates the cinema,
right?
Mr. Verloc is always kind of in the background. He's always removing himself or acting in situations that are a bit strange. There's their family. There's also the family of the bomb maker,
indeed,
who live above the pet store, the bird shop. The older gentleman who makes the bombs, his daughter, and her daughter, his granddaughter, right? And there's even an odd little moment where he goes to the granddaughter and says, "Oh, granddad's been very naughty. You have to slap him very hard." And it's like, well, who's in charge here? Like, what kind of family is this? And those stories are bookended by a couple of Hitchcock's. Or there's interesting repetition all over.
Right.
This film,
Yes.
Of images, of situations. One odd repetition, kind of striking one to me, is that there are some jokes about gender reversal, and gender roles at both the beginning and the end of the film. At the close of the aquarium scene early on, we see a young couple exiting. The man in the couple is in fact the British actor Charles Hawtrey, who will go on to a long career. But he says to his companion, these bivalves are very strange, right? After the female gives birth, she changes her sex. And his companion says, "Well, I would too after I'd laid 1,000,000 eggs." And that's echoed at the end of the film by Stevie, who sees the two canaries and asks, "Well, which one is the gentleman?" Right? And he says, "Well, wouldn't it be funny if the gentleman laid an egg? Wouldn't everyone be surprised?" And so I think it's interesting that Hitchcock is playing with these ideas of families that are not traditional, right, or in which things are a bit out of order, in which traditional gender roles have gotten mixed up, a bit, and that's remarked on and played on a bit.
Well, and there are also these, in both instances of the families, there are these ways in which there's a potential confusion of spaces. So, for example, we have this fluidity between their apartment and the cinema itself. So, and she goes out, we can talk about this significance later, but she goes out, she's immediately in the cinema that is in some sense commenting, upon this. You can be standing behind this. So you're saying, well, wait, where are the traditional gateways between your commercial life, your family life, your intimate life? But then coming back to the bomb maker, there's that extraordinary moment in which he opens the cabinet and there's the doll there. And I say it's extraordinary because you're saying, are they hiding bombs in dolls now? But it turns out they're not. It's just like, oh, I put it up there. But you're saying, well, wait a minute. There's this very dangerous mixture of all the elements, in this space that makes the family life extraordinarily unpredictable, according to normal patterns of things.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's part of the really, it's a disturbing film in a lot of ways. I think part of it is this sense that things are out of joint, right? That spaces are mixed up, that people's roles are unclear, almost in at times in maybe a bit of a xenophobic sense, right? London has been invaded by these people with foreign accents. Yes, it's a really, yeah.
Well, let me just introduce this whole idea. First of all, the idea that this is a London film. I mean, and Hitchcock, in planning the film, and he went to extraordinary lengths to things he could not capture. There are things he captures on the street, but to build things that would, imitate, as far as he could get them to imitate what he viewed as the liveliness of London as a city. But I'm using that word liveliness with caution, because I think one of the things you've just introduced is that there is the possibility that in this large, chaotic city, you can find a sense of home and homeliness. Okay, there's that possibility. But there's also the possibility in this city that we keep seeing that the thing that's supposed to be that is in fact uncanny and dangerous. And so it's a fascinating place, but where's the safe zone and where's the danger zone? And that includes, in the film, visually, that includes vast public spaces, but it also includes intimate spaces as well. So that the whole notion of, is a city like London a place of refuge for people where they can find at-homeness, or is it inherently I'm about to use the wrong word, explosive place, but it came to mind. No, but in which that danger is there in the unpredictable way of you're sitting and minding your own business and your bus blows up.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that that sense of both homeliness and dangers is captured really nicely in the brief shots toward the end of the film, where we are seeing the crowds through Mrs. Verloc's eyes.
Yeah.
And in these chaotic scenes, she repeatedly sees people who she thinks are Stevie,
right,
her dead brother,
right,
who turns out he's not there, or she's mistaken someone else for him, right? But it's like she sees kin and family,
right,
in the urban crowd, but it turns out to be an illusion, right? It's a kind of seductive illusion. It is a wonderful city film, and there are incredible shots of sort of bustling streets, right? The sort of snake oil salesmen and hawkers that Stevie in particular encounters as he tries to make his way across London are very compelling. Some of the films, it has odd moments of humor
absolutely
that come out of that, often come from the street and the sort of crowd of people. But it's also it's at once a city that you can move through, right, very rapidly, all right? And this is the sort of classic, the 20th century metropolis, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Rapid transit. We see images of buses, right, of power plants, which are in fact harken back to some sort of early modernist art, the early 20th century, futurist and vorticist depictions of the city in those early shots of the power plant in the film. Right, but Stevie's, the sort of key sequence is Stevie's journey with the film canisters
absolutely
and the bomb, in which, as he tries to make his way across London, he's repeatedly sort of trapped, waylaid, right? He's pulled into a demonstration of a toothpaste, right? And then of a hair oil. He can't make his way across the street because the Lord Mayor's parade is coming, which we see his face, right, looking on kind of joyfully at this spectacle, but it also prevents him from getting anywhere.
Right, absolutely.
Finally, he gets on the bus. The bus isn't going anywhere. It's stuck in traffic. And it leads to that whole long sequence where we're waiting for, is this bomb going to go off? What's going to happen? The tension is heightened by, I think, the puppy that he plays with on the bus.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
No, absolutely. And the fact that it's been marked that he is a dangerous passenger because of the fact that he's carrying the flammable film, whereas the innocuous tin is the actual danger point. And that's the kind of the way in which that's the turn of the screw of irony in in Hitchcock, that kind of like, no, you don't know where the danger really really is. It's not the obvious thing, it's the not obvious thing. I think that's a very good point, that this film joins a whole group of films of the 20s and the 1930s that are very interested in the modern metropolis and its many characteristics, including the efficiency of the underground, yet the chaos of the street at the same time. But also the chaos of the street as not always danger, but also as performance. The whole city is performative in that in that way. Okay, so let's loop back a little bit into Hitchcock's design of the film, because you were talking about some other interesting things. Because we do have in the film, a couple of lines of plot. Obviously, there's an investigation. There's going to be a crime plotted. Can it be prevented? And at the same time, we also have a developing romance plot. So we got those two things. I want to come back to those. But then one of the things I think you pointed towards, which is very interesting about the film and its pleasures, its richness, is that there's all kinds of other, what I'll call, patternings across the film. Yeah. And you and I were talking a little bit about that earlier. What do you find about that?
Well, it's this is something, for one thing, this is something that cinema can do with the visual image, that literature cannot do in the same ways. So, for example, we see Hitchcock, and this is part of the larger story of Hitchcock, but we see repeated shots, repeated situations in this film, which are often played, I think, the first time as farce, and the second time as tragedy. So, for example, we see things from a first-person point of view at a couple of key moments. When Mr. Verloc, at the beginning of the film, is pretending to be asleep, his wife comes in with a flashlight and shines it in his face. We briefly see things from his perspective, He can't see her. He can only see the light shining at his face. Later in the film, we see from Mrs. Verloc's point of view, and I've already mentioned, that she sees her dead brother in the crowd and in other young men sort of running around, but we see those things from her point of view, the first time in a kind of farcical way, and the second time in a really traumatic way. There are also sort of the opening situation, in which Mr. Verloc has, unfortunately for his handlers, made London laugh, with his brief power outage. The people in his cinema are demanding their money back, and there's a long, sort of drawn out set of speeches where various people say, well, it's an act of God, it's providence, you can't demand that you get your money back when no one's responsible for this. And that whole debate is actually wiped out when the lights come back on. Everyone's allowed back into the cinema. At the end of the film, we actually, I think, get a similar situation in a much darker key. Where after Stevie's death, the murder of Mr. Verloc, or the killing of Mr. Verloc, the explosion at the cinema, there's a sense of who is to blame here, Like who is responsible? Is Mr. Verloc, has he killed Stevie, as Mrs. Verloc says? Well, yes, certainly in a sense, But also he tries to take the package himself, but sees the detective outside, so he decides he can't. He's been strong-armed into doing this job because he needs money, by his handlers to keep the cinema going. Does Mrs. Verloc intentionally kill him? It's not entirely clear, I don't think. He seems to perhaps be attacking her. It's almost as if he throws himself onto the knife. So at the end of the film, there are these questions, who's responsible? Just as with the cinema, and people's ticket money. Who's responsible for all this? Well, the explosion at the cinema wipes that out, And there's perhaps a clean slate, The detectives say, well, we've got nothing on her. And in the final shot, we see Spencer and Mrs. Verloc disappearing into into the London crowd.
Well, yeah,
right, disappearing into the city.
absolutely.
But there are these strange echoes. It's a kind of a film in two halves, where often images or situations from the first half are replayed in the second in a much darker key.
Well, and I just want to point out that this is one of the things, this is one of the reasons we're still studying Hitchcock.
Sure.
You know, because in something that, you know, oh, it's a thriller espionage a story, and yet, you know, over 75 years later, we're seeing that there's a richness of artistic design here that keeps us so interested in the film. I mean, it's whatever we may take away interpretively from the film, we're still deeply engaged in it. And part of that has to do with certain Hitchcock, you know, traits of his cinema strategies, but also it has to do with this overall design that is just more than a plot summary. It's much more, because it's much richer than that in some way. We've got just a minute or so left, so let's take up the fact that you and I think, agree about the fact that the detective, and everybody agrees about this, the detective is not as compelling as one would wish him to be. That is normally seen as one of the weaker features of the film. But there's another way of interpreting that I think corresponds to a lot of the way that Hitchcock also works. What would that other interpretation be?
Certainly. Well, you know, the critic Graham Greene, novelist and critic Graham Greene, who famously hated Hitchcock, did not like his films, but liked Sabotage, wrote a review of it in which he's acknowledged that it was a strong film and found that it was wrapped up quite neatly at the end, and noted, as you say, that the characterization of Spencer, the detective, is one of its weaker points. I'm not sure that the ending is quite so neat, actually. And part of what makes it curious is that I'm struck by how neither Mr. Verloc nor Spencer actually seem to see Mrs. Verloc for what she is, right, at the end of the film.
And we do.
I think we do.
Yes,
yeah.
I think you're correct.
Yeah. You know, Mr. Verloc, of course, says, well, we've got to get on with it now. You know, sorry that your brother is dead, but buck up, right? But then the detective, who, you know, Greene sees as the sort of love interest who's there to catch her when she falls, is also sort of tries to compel her to do things she seems to not want to do.
From the very beginning through the end,
Yeah. And he's a kind of sentimentalist, right? He says, oh, I love you, do anything for you, I'll sweep you away, right? She actually doesn't seem that interested in that at times. And now whether that's a weakness of characterization in the film or I think kind of a fascinating ambiguity about its conclusion.
No, and there is, I mean, the other mark of the slight ambiguity is when the chief detective says, no, did she say this before or after? I really can't remember. So we as audiences are left with ambiguities that that others may not have, but those ambiguities are available. I got to say that there is, at this moment, no ambiguity about the fact that we're going to have to go away, that we've come to the end of our time. If you'd like to know more about City Cinematheque, or you'd like to know more in general about the programming here at City University Television, please visit our website, www.tv.cuny.edu. There you're going to find information about all of our programming and also links to the way in which you can watch our programming, not only on cable, but on our YouTube channels. Access them anytime you want. So please visit www.tv.cuny.edu. Thank you for a lively 30 minutes. Look forward to another discussion sometime.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure. And thank you for joining us here on City Cinematheque as we stroll through the archives of film history. See you again.